Many rights organizations, including 25 international human rights organizations, dedicate their efforts to protecting human rights and ending human rights abuses. Universal Declaration of Human Rights is known for having inspired and paved the way for adoption of more than 70 human rights treaties. Several articles in the People's Republic of China's constitution provides constitutional protection for citizens' rights and freedoms. But in reality, on ground, neither the provisions of these treaties nor the constitutional provisions are practiced. It is Tibetan New Year, one of the most important traditional festivals celebrated in lights and colors. But the human rights situation inside Tibet is getting darker each passing year. Let us review the situation of human rights in Tibet this past year with Tenzin Kunkhen, Research Associate at UNEUHR Human Rights Desk under Tibet Advocacy Section, Department of Information and International Relations, Central Tibetan Administration. Welcome to Tibettv Studio, Kunkhen.
Thank you for having me, Jimla.
Kunkhen, so how would you describe the overall situation of human rights inside Tibet in the year 2022 when we look back?
In 2022, the Chinese government, led by President Xi Jinping, continued to implement repressive and discriminatory policies against Tibetans inside Tibet, resulting in the further repression of their religious rights, assimilation of Tibetan culture and language, marginalization of Tibetan nomads and farmers from their ancestral lands, and deterioration of Tibetan environment. From the fatal mismanagement of COVID outbreak in Tibet under the zero COVID policy to the reports of China's vast network of colonial-style boarding schools in large operation across Tibetan areas aimed at eradicating the Tibetan identity, including language, culture and religion, and also the mass DNA collection samples from children as young as 5-year-olds, the gross violation of human rights in Tibet in 2022 remain largely rampant and continue to exist. According to reliable exile media reports, the Chinese government in 2022 unfairly arrested and detained at least 94 Tibetans, and among them the Chinese court sentenced 14 Tibetans to prison terms ranging from 2 years to 14 years for merely exercising their basic fundamental rights. This year, at least 5 Tibetan political prisoners had died as a result of torture, bringing the total amount of torture deaths to at least 55 since 2008. The PRC government should release all these detainees who are arrested and sentenced wrongfully for exercising their inborn rights throughout China and in the occupied areas. Tibet is again listed as one of the world's least free region in the world in 2022 by the report released by Freedom House.
True. So you were talking about the fatal mismanagement of the so-called zero COVID policy. So that was one of the most evident repressions by the Communist Party of China that we all saw. Consequently, there were so many people who suffered under this policy, including the Tibetans in Tibetan areas. The massive crackdown on Tibetans in the name of the zero COVID policy. So that was also the time when we saw Chinese vast system of surveillance and vast system of censorship struggling to catch up as well. So could you describe the situation that Tibetans were in, according to the reports, of course?
One of the notorious events of 2022 in Tibet was the COVID outbreak, which was handled poorly by the Chinese government when it was first announced in August last year, resulting in the massive unrest and fatalities among Tibetans. Soon after, the Chinese government imposed its zero COVID policy, composed of strict lockdown, discriminatory quarantine, crowded facilities, unhygienic living conditions, and lack of medical supplies. These miserable and horrendous conditions were initially covered up by the Chinese government, but when the Tibetans started calling for help through online social media platforms, they were arrested and punished severely, including imprisonment and detention for their action. Worse still is the news of Tibetans committing suicides because of the unbearable hardships and conditions they have to suffer at those times. As reported by exile media such as Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy and the International Campaign for Tibet, in September, 5 Tibetans jumped off their buildings in Tibet's capital Lhasa to escape from the intolerable conditions in just 3 days. China remains legally liable and party to various international conventions, but in the time of the pandemic, its treatment of Tibetans violates multiple rights and freedoms, including freedom of expression and the right to information.
So, Kunkhen, you were talking about this forced DNA sample collection from children as young as 5-year-olds. So there were a lot of reports on China's human rights violations and violations of linguistic and educational rights of the Tibetans. So there were reports of children being forcefully enrolled in these boarding schools, colonial-style boarding schools. And then there were reports of children, all Tibetans, including children, forcefully being taken for DNA sample collections. So how do you see these developments threatening for Tibetans?
One of Beijing's most concerning policies in the recent times is the colonial-style boarding schools, especially targeted at the Tibetan children and the younger generations, as rightly exposed by the report released in 2021 by the Tibet Action Institute. The report, separated from families and hidden from the world, released by the Tibet Action Institute, remains one of the most comprehensive report and greatest insights into these colonial-style boarding schools, with great implications and consequences on the survival of the Tibetan identity, including the culture, religion and language. According to the report, an estimated 800,000 to 900,000 Tibetan children aged 6 to 18 and 100,000 Tibetan children aged 4 to 6 are forcibly enrolled in these schools. Separated from their families and communities, these children are taught only in Mandarin Chinese language and isolated from their cultural and religious traditions for an extended period of time. The Chinese authorities closed a number of Tibetan schools in order to force parents to send their children to such boarding schools. On an individual level, these Tibetan children are subjected to mental and emotional trauma as contact with their parents and families are restricted. On a larger scale, these boarding schools not only endangers the Tibetan language and culture, but also disregards multiple human rights instruments, including the rights of the child. And with regard to the mass DNA sample collection from Tibetan children, as reported by the Toronto-based Citizen Lab, between June 2016 and July 2022, the Chinese police may have collected roughly around 1.2 million DNA samples, representing 1/3 of the so-called Tibet Autonomous Region's total population. The Chinese police purportedly use rationalizations of strengthening crime fighting and social stability as justification for the mass DNA collection. However, Tibetan children as young as 5-year-olds and adults at the age of 65 have had their DNA collected without their consent. Such campaigns are covertly designed to intensify political surveillance of Tibetans and adapted as part of China's all-encompassing surveillance mechanism. As much as the government claims that their DNA database system will help reunite missing people with relatives, it could also be used to prosecute, arrest and detain government critics, civil society activists, monks and ordinary citizens. Tibetans are henceforth becoming more vulnerable to be subject to human rights violations. Nevertheless, the mass DNA collection is a serious violation of Chinese laws as well as international standards and norms, which China is entitled to oblige.
When you see the response from the international community regarding the human rights situation inside Tibet, how do you like to describe it? Was there enough attention?
Tibet and Tibetan people continue to receive international support and solidarity in 2022. And these supports, as you have mentioned, came in the form of resolutions, motions, reports, and communications voicing serious concerns on the human rights situation and rights violation of the Tibetan people to the Chinese government. For instance, a bipartisan bill called Promoting a Resolution to the Tibet-China Conflict Act was introduced last year in July in the United States Congress. The bill serves two main goals of asserting the rights and the self-determination of Tibetan people, and secondly to pressure the Chinese government to engage in a meaningful and peaceful dialogue with the representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to resolve the Tibet-China conflict. The bill was successfully passed in the House of Representatives, and in December it was introduced in the US Senate. And also a number of reports condemning China's atrocious acts of rights violations and policies targeting Tibetan people were released. And further, a number of UN experts and special rapporteurs called on China to address human rights violation and demanded unhindered access to Tibet. In November last year, 4 UN special rapporteurs with mandates on minority issues, right to education, freedom of religion or belief, and cultural rights voiced their concerns over China's vast network of colonial boarding schools in Tibet, while also asking several questions to China about its policy of acculturation and assimilation of the Tibetan culture. Various UN member states have also raised grave concerns about the human rights situation in Tibet during UN Human Rights Council sessions last year. The CTA and NGOs and other organizations conducted Tibet advocacy campaigns and visits in a number of countries around the world. And I believe that the international government and organizations were overwhelmingly supportive, and it is essential to keep the Tibetan movement alive until peace and freedom are restored in Tibet.
Kunkhen, the Human Rights Desk has started profiling Tibetan political prisoners, coinciding with the December 10 International Human Rights Day last year. So could you describe the plight of Tibetan political prisoners, particularly in the year 2022?
As China continued to arrest, detain and sentence Tibetan people inside Tibet to prison terms for mere expression of their fundamental rights, a huge number of Tibetan prisoners since the illegal occupation of Tibet continue to languish in prisons across Tibet. So this year, under the leadership of Kunkhen and department heads, the Human Rights section of the Department of Information and International Relations began profiling the Tibetan political prisoners in December in commemorating with the International Human Rights Day, and has continued to do so every Saturday. So the primary aim or the objective of this weekly political profiling is to remind the Chinese government of its international obligations and call it to respect the rights of the Tibetan people and stop the human rights violation that is rampant across Tibet. The weekly profiling also aims to bring justice to the Tibetan prisoners by bringing their plights and attention to the international community, and call for their immediate release from the Chinese prisons. So for our first case profile, we chose Tibet's 11th Panchen Lama, popularly known as Kendin Chögying, who continue to remain enforcedly disappeared and in the custody of the Chinese government since 1995. The other prisoners we have profiled so far includes Gosherab Gyatsola, a renowned Tibetan Buddhist teacher, and we also have Kangye Drupakyap, who is a renowned Tibetan writer, and we have Tsering Joma, who was sentenced to 8 years of imprisonment in October last year. We also have profiled Doji Tashi and Anya Sengdra, each of whom have been sentenced to long prison terms just for exercising his or her basic rights. So in my opinion, the Chinese government must pay heed and listen to the concerns of the Tibetan people living inside Tibet and treat them according to the international and national standards which it is bound to observe.
Thank you, Kunkhen, for being with us here and taking your time out for this interview or reviewing human rights situation inside Tibet in the year 2022.
Thank you, Chimla, for having me. Thank you very much.
2022 has ended with human rights abuses in all forms inside Tibet by the Communist Party of China becoming widespread and systematic under the guise of various nation-building campaigns and policies. That was our episode on Human Rights in Tibet 2022, a review. Thank you for watching Tibettv.